If you want an example of a film where the plot doesn't matter, look no further than to the Robert Altman adaptation of the Raymond Chandler novel The Long Goodbye. The substance lies in the themes and the subtext to be drawn out of the film. His hero does nothing of consequence except for a single act of violence. Every incident he's drawn into, his wants and needs are entirely secondary. Every pleasure gained from the experience of watching it is gained from everything else. The cinematography by Vilmos Zsigmond, the performances by among others Elliott Gould as Philip Marlowe and Sterling Hayden, or the funny detail of John Williams' score consisting of a single piece of music, appearing orchestrally on the soundtrack and diegetically, for example, by piano, whistling, or as a Mexican marching band. In a review by Roger Ebert, he wrote that the plot of The Long Goodbye can be summarized in a few words or endlessly. A friend arrives at Philip Marlowe's apartment, Terry Lennox. He asks for a ride to Tijuana. Marlowe complies. It turns out, though, Lennox murdered his wife, and in Mexico, Lennox commits suicide. From there, Marlowe is approached about the disappearance of the writer Roger Wade, and a gangster called Augustine, whom Lennox ran money for, thinks Marlowe and Lennox conspired to keep the money. All this whirlwind of plots somehow keeps Marlowe in the center as a patsy for about every side to use and abuse as they wish. In the dark corners of the new Hollywood revival of the American studio system, there are a few dark pearls that glimmer on in spite of their lack of iconic status. One great example is Elaine May's Mikey and Nicky, starring Peter Falk and John Cassavetes. It's probably the subject of a future episode. Another one is The Long Goodbye. The Long Goodbye is no Apocalypse Now. It's not Annie Hall or Jaws. It is, however, a tiny part of the massive psychoanalytical effort of the male psyche that define a generation scarred by Vietnam. Something which lies in the subtext of the entire American cinema of the 1970s. There have been many before who's mentioned how Marlowe wakes up in the first scene as from a previous age. Philip Marlowe waking up in the midst of Vietnam and Watergate into a new world of rampant crime and sexual freedom. His neighbors are a clique of topless hippie women. Marlowe's attempt to make sense of a senseless world, and he doesn't get the upper hand until he stoops to the lows of his adversaries. Doesn't this sound like the worldview of a reactionary? One where might makes right and justice is impossible? Yeah. But I think that's the point. I feel it's bigger than just a nihilistic Chinatown ending where there is no redemption. Not that Marlowe reaches redemption, but that he could. In the end, he takes on the role of a court jester in a parody of the famous ending of The Third Man. If you can't beat him, join him. In the mosaic of American cinema that was the 70s, I think The Long Goodbye is the most metaphysical one, as far as I'm aware at least. The other great metaphysical film is of course Apocalypse Now. Travel to the heart of darkness and what you find is a good American boy. In The Long Goodbye, though, that boy has come home and he's confused. By the new rules of sex, by the lack of moral core to the American identity that was lost to the mists of time. Maybe The Long Goodbye is to the old world of innocence. Maybe The Long Goodbye is to the old world of innocence. Maybe it's a goodbye to childhood. I think that the great stories are about coming of age, of the loss of innocence in a way. The Long Goodbye is not a great story The Long Goodbye is not a great story, that is not where its strengths lie, but in a way, it is about the loss of innocence. What one must remember when watching American cinema of the 70s is The Long Goodbye is shot like a New York film despite taking place in LA. The bars are drowning in shadows. When interrogated, the cops behind the one-way mirror quip while surrounded by darkness. The heat of the LA sun is toned down like pastel. Nowhere is the burning heat of the sun present, even at the party where Wade is faced with his pressing money trouble. Then there are the faces. Elliott Gould, of course, as the free-form, free-associating Philip Marlowe, with the curly hair, the lanky figure, and ill-sitting suit and tie. The ratty gangsters, Lennox and Augustine. The burly Sterling Hayden as the alcoholic writer, Roger Wade, a taken name since his original one was deemed too boring. And the aging beach babe, Mrs. Eileen Wade. The gangsters harassing Marlowe are the most obvious subjects of moral decay. There is not much violence in the film, but Augustine is the one who commits the most horrific on-screen act of violence against his girlfriend, just to make an example. Lennox, on the other hand, draws Marlowe into the entire mess, justifying it simply with "that's what friends do." Then there's the Wades. They inhabit the grey area, where they admit morality but throws it aside for the sake of pleasure. Roger lost in his alcoholism, Eileen taken up by an affair with a different man, almost even with Marlowe. The point of being an adult is to learn how to exist in the world. That is the failure of Marlowe in The Long Goodbye, I think. The film begins with him trying to trick his cat and failing. And therefore he tries to solve the problem. He goes to buy the cat food he knows his cat will enjoy. In this new corrupt world, this is his fatal flaw. Until the end, he can't lay his point of view down as a matter of the law. And even in the end, he can't. He must submit to a philosophical system he should and thus abhor. I can't quite place it in the entire arc of Robert Altman's filmography or the history of the neo-noir. I don't know either of the subjects well enough, but it takes place in a kind of subversive counterculture cinema, among, for example, the previously named Mikey and Nicky, or Chungking Express, The Lovers on the Bridge, and Ghost Dog, The Way of the Samurai from the 90s. In those metaphysical terms I mentioned previously, The Long Goodbye is, from my experience, the film most concerned with the core darkness of the new Hollywood cinema. It circles in on the subject of moral corruption in exacting details in a way few of the other films of that time really did. Even then, it turns into this carnivalesque comedy of crime, where the great moral hero turns into the fool. The fool is, of course, the litmus test for what the ruling class will accept as speech. And in this modernity of corruption, the crime can never be revealed. The moral hero must therefore choose to become the clown or be destroyed.